Very good. All right, with that, I'll turn it over to JW and to give the talk, and I'll preempt it by saying you're on board for running the Q&A session afterwards too. So I'll kind of just step back from here and turn it over to JW. Thanks so much.
Okay, well, thank you for asking me to do this. So I changed the title somewhat from what Ed announced, but I will be talking about what he actually announced. So evolutionary social science organizations and politics. Our topic for the week was supposed to be politics, so I tried to also sort of weave that in, at least towards the end. And what I will try to do, so what my objective is for today, is to sketch the contours of an evolutionary understanding of organizations and institutions as major transitions, which is a term from evolutionary theory, of course, we'll get to that. And at the same time, give an idea of how this might improve, this evolutionary understanding might improve on X and social science theory. Now, that's a bit much, so I'm going to narrow it down, I'll focus. I will be talking mostly about the firm, and especially towards the end, in particular about the public corporation. So the public corporation would mean the big firms which have publicly traded shares, which are in terms of numbers, if you think in terms of populations and population structures, or maybe different types of firm species, whatever analogy you want to take. Public corporations are relatively few in numbers compared to organizations in general, or firms in general, businesses in general. But they account for a big part of our economy, of course. And the politics part will come in when I discuss towards the end, if I have time, because I will have to speed up to get there. But the politics will come in when I discuss very shortly the corporate governance of these public corporations. And as I said above here, that I wanted to also give an idea of how an evolutionary understanding of firms may improve on X and social science theory, and the contrast, or my target in contrasting an evolutionary view, will be received, or standard received traditional economic theory. So that's what I will do. Very, very quickly from my background, which may help you understand where I'm coming from. I am by training a management scholar, which means that I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I'm not a specialist in anything in particular, including evolutionary theorizing, but I did become interested in that quite a long time ago. And I have also published on it, and in fact, in let's say minor economic journals, not in the really big economic journals, but in minor but serious economic journals. So I'm not an evolutionary theorist or a philosopher. I'm not an economist. I'm trained in management, and in that sense, I'm a bit of a generalist. So that is maybe important to keep in mind. So my publishing, here's a whole list. I'm not showing that for any other reason than it may pop up somewhere in our file, so you can go back to it if you would be interested. And to point out that I was heavily involved in that quite a while ago. So from 2002 until 2012, I was really heavily involved in doing this sort of work. All the later publications on this list are more invited pieces. And I've been doing other things that I will mention in a second since then, which will also shine through a little bit in what I'm going to say today. But of this evolutionary stuff, three of the things on the previous slide are sort of playing a role in what I'm going to say, and that's these three. So I did this work when I was interacting a lot with people that would refer to themselves as institutional economists, and specifically evolutionary institutional economists, many of whom would go by the label of heterodox. So they are sort of pushing against the mainstream of economics, and that has influenced me a little bit. But I stopped seeing that as my main network, in which I moved about 10 years ago. And since then, I've been working more in what is the mainstay for me as a management scholar, so management theory. And a particular branch of that is called stakeholder theory. And stakeholder theory is trying to offer an alternative narrative of capitalism. And the alternative is then an alternative to the traditional neoclassical economic narrative, and especially also its shareholder primacy view of the firm. And you will see some of that shining through in what I say as well. So I could give you a list of what I've been doing the last 10 years in terms of publications, but it sort of defeats the purpose of what we're here for. The second point on this slide is that I'm currently working on something that I hope will be one of my major papers in the near future, which is an evolutionary theory of the firm. And then I really mean an understanding of the firm through an evolutionary lens. So that's where I'll be going. So my agenda is to talk about three things. The first one being the most important, I think. The other two can probably be a little bit quicker. And as you will see in terms of our group here and what we've been talking about in the last few weeks, many things come back. So evolutionary explanation in general will come back in the first part. There will be a bit on ontology and epistemology, but all apply to the firm. And our topic for this week, politics, as I said, will be in the last part. So let's get started on that, on the actual content. So on evolutionary explanation, explaining the firm is a major transition. Let me catch up with myself in my notes here. So if we want to explain something, we need a question. And one famous question in economics when it comes to firm is simply the question, why do firms exist? In fact, Ronald Coase, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, actually the Nobel Prize in economics is not a real Nobel Prize, but we still refer to it like that. He asked this question famously in 1937, and it seems maybe a strange question, but it's not in the context of economic theorizing. The way that Coase and later economists framed their answer to this question, so the traditional economic approach to answering this question, is basically the following. So economists will say, okay, we have this idea about markets. Markets are efficient. Why then would firms exist? Well, they must somehow be an alternative to this market, and not just Coase, who won a Nobel Prize, but also Williamson, who won another Nobel Prize in economics, basically frame the question of explaining why firms exist in terms of firms as an alternative to the market. And then the answers that these people offer are in terms of why firms may be more efficient than markets in allocating scarce resources. That's how economists frame the question. Why are firms more efficient than markets? And then they develop more detailed explanations of why that is and under which circumstances that might be the case. So if that is one of the mainstays of so-called organizational economics, and we want to do an evolutionary count of this, then how might we approach this question, the question, why do firms exist, from an evolutionary perspective? I think asking a question like this, the one that I'm showing you on the slide right now, gets us to taking evolutionary explanation seriously and taking seriously the idea of using evolutionary explanation in the social sciences. In this case, by trying to explain why firms exist from a different perspective, from a different framing of the question than what economics has been doing. So if we ask this question, where might we go in terms of evolutionary explanation? And I just want to start with Tinbergen's 4 whys. And Tinbergen was an ecologist. This is the biologist Tinbergen, or the ecologist Tinbergen. He also had a brother who won yet another Nobel Prize in economics, but I'm talking about the biologist, not the economist. And Tinbergen has these 4 whys. And as an ecologist, he was interested in explaining the behavior of firms. And he then talks about that you could have different types of explanations. And what we recognize here, I think some of you may know this, maybe most of you know this, is that there are both proximate and ultimate explanations. And typically, evolutionary explanations are most readily associated with the ultimate explanation of something. But even there's 2 types. So there's a functional explanation, and there's a phylogenetic. That's the phylogenetic is the actually evolutionary explanation. That's sort of the historical story. So functional explanation is about adaptive fit. Something evolves because it is adaptive. The phylogenetic story is then sort of a complementary, if you will, historical story about why in that particular historical context something may have been adaptive. And together those would be the ultimate explanations. There are also proximate explanations. I will very quickly refer to that later, but we'll leave that for the moment. So going back to my previous slides, how might we approach the question, why do firms exist from an evolutionary perspective? I think calls for us to develop a functional explanation complemented by a phylogenetic historical evolutionary explanation. So that's where I think we should be going, in trying to answer the question, why do firms exist? Now that, I think, brings us to a next question. How do we, or how could we, or should we think of firms? Now, firms are in some sense higher level collective entities. So if you start with individuals that are competing, then something like a firm is an organized unit of individuals and is, in a sense, a collective entity, a higher level of organization. Now, once I start talking about high level of organization in an evolutionary perspective, that quickly brings me to what Ed announced in the title that he gave you, the so-called major transitions. And for me, there is a very close, not just analogy, but a close resemblance, if you will, between major transitions as discussed by Maynard Smith and Z. Marie, and that's what I will follow up with in trying to understand firms. But a close analogy between major transitions and multi-level selection, as well as the notions of social dilemmas and collective action problems. Now, Hardin, for instance, the tragedy of the commons, or Ostrom's work about the commons, is about one type of collective action problem, as economists would typically call it. They typically refer to collective action problems. The social psychologists typically refer to social dilemmas. And I think this class of problems has the same logical structure or tension as in multi-level selection and in major transition. So what are social dilemmas, as, like I said, a social psychologist might call them? This is one definition. It's not the most, it's not the prettiest definition, but it's, I think, very clear. So social dilemmas are situations in which a non-cooperative course of action is, at least at times, tempting for each individual, in that it yields superior, often short-term outcomes for the self. But if all pursue this non-cooperative course of action, all are, often in the longer term, worse off than if all had cooperated. So a public good game or a social commons all have elements of this social dilemma where there's a tension between the individual self-interest and the collective interest. And this tension, I think, is, I'm going back to my previous slides, is central not just to social dilemmas, or as economists would call it, collective action problems. It's central to multi-level selection, but it's also central to major transitions. And these major transitions, this is the idea of how higher levels of organization, if you will, that's maybe a simplistic way of putting it, but how higher levels of organization have evolved in evolutionary history. And an example is maybe the most obvious one. They have a whole list. Maynard Smith and Z. Marie have a whole list of these transitions. But the most obvious one, maybe intuitively, is to go from a single-celled organism to a multi-cell organism. And that is just one of a few examples. But what you get if you want to get to a multi-cellular organism is that you need to solve this tension between the individual interest of the individual cells and the collective interest of the sort of new level of selection, which is the multicellular organism. And if this is successful in the long run, you're basically solving the multi-level selection problem, if you will, in such a way that at some point the individual members, the individual cells, can no longer survive without this higher level of organization. They can only survive now as part of the multicellular organism. So our individual cells cannot survive outside of our body, if you will. This is what the philosopher of biology Gottfried Smith has referred to as de-Darwinization. And as a side point, there's all kinds of interesting questions you can ask about us as humanity, in the sense of to what degree we are in a process of de-Darwinization where we as individuals can no longer really survive without, well, certain types of organizations, like, for instance, firms. Yeah, but I won't get into that. But it's an interesting philosophical discussion where we are in this process of de-Darwinization. Now, what is interesting for what I'm going to argue next is that there, despite the fact that there have been multiple major transitions in evolutionary history, what Maynard Smith and Z. Marie are trying to do is to deduce some sort of general logic to all of them, despite the fact that they're very different. And what they say, and I'm partly paraphrasing, is that this involves always a new quote unquote language. And they first talk about this language in terms of literally, this is a literal quote, changes in the way information is stored and transmitted. So for instance, one of their examples is for a system where RNA was doing everything to further division of labor between DNA and RNA and proteins. And then there's a different way of information storing and transmission. And you can think of all kinds of stuff that some of you know much more about than I do, about genetics, about epigenetics and what have you. But of course, this can be generalized. And that's what I will be getting to when I return to firms. So major transitions are about a higher level of organization evolving, emerging, in such a way that the lower levels of organization, at least to some degree, can no longer survive without this higher entity being successful, this higher level of organization being successful. And that requires overcoming social dilemmas or the multi-level selection tension. And in order to overcome that, in these major transitions, you will typically find that there is a new language interpreted in a broad sense, that helps make this transformation to the higher level of organization possible. And what I've added here at the bottom of the slide is more my own addition. What this information does is also coordinate the lower level entities into a working higher level entity, if you will. Now let's try to apply this idea then to firms. And in order to get there on this ultimate evolutionary explanation, we have to start in deep evolutionary history. So how would major transitions, understood in this way, how would that apply to human organization in general and to modern firms in particular? How could we understand human organization as a major transition? My understanding of that is along the following lines. So we became human, Homo sapiens, if you will, by becoming interdependent. So we developed a survival strategy that made us highly interdependent. Now, interdependence comes inherently with social dilemmas and collective action problems. So there is inherently then this tension of between the individual and the collective interest. For instance, a rational player in economic terms would tend to free ride on the cooperative contributions of the other team members. So how do you deal with this? Well, you need to, in order to be able to live in an interdependent way, as we started to do somewhere in our evolutionary history as humans, in order to successfully deal with this interdependence, you need to solve this tension, this collective action problem. And in essence, that means finding a way to overcome self-interested behavior. Overcome self-interested behavior in favor of group-oriented behavior, if you will. And this relates in part back to what David was already talking about, so to our moral psychology. How did we do this? Well, there's all kinds of things to say about this. My short version of that story would be basically, in order to explain how we as humans were able to evolve cooperative behavior in the face of collective action problems, we need to look for something along the lines of this new language that Maynard Smith and Marie are talking about. Now, obviously, what we are capable of is that most other species are not capable of is symbolic language, but that's still quite generic. So how does this symbolic language help us to be cooperative, even when there is a tension between our individual self-interest and a collective interest? How exactly does symbolic language help us overcome this tension in collective action problems? And my central proposition here is simply that we evolved a psychology, a social, or if you will, moral psychology that underpins this new language in the sense of Maynard Smith and Marie. And that language is a moral language. And it's this moral language, this way in which we communicate, we store and transmit information, but we communicate in order to coordinate among us as individuals towards a collective goal. That moral language is doing the trick of overcoming the collective action problems, if and when we overcome it, because we don't always obviously do that. And this moral language in evolutionary history evolved probably precisely because of the problem of collective action problems that came from this interdependent survival strategy. So we have a long history of evolving a specific part of the functioning of our brain, the social moral part of our brain, evolved specifically to solve these problems that come with interdependence, these social dilemma, collective action problems. That's a central proposition. Now, how do we get from here to firms? Because that's where I'm heading, obviously. This is in deep evolutionary history. Well, basically, I just discussed the first of two, what Dennett would call cranes. So Dennett's point is we don't want theories that have skyhooks, that sort of have unexplained concepts that hold up the whole theoretical structure. It has to sort of evolve from the bottom up. Evolutionary processes need to evolve cranes that can then lift the evolutionary process up further. And I just discussed the first crane, the biological crane of human social and moral psychology. But there are also, and I'm not sure if there's literature that has developed this idea yet. I'm not aware of any. I came up with it myself, but maybe somebody else has done the same thing. There are also cultural cranes. And when it comes to firms, law, and especially codified law, is an important part of the cultural crane that got us to firms, and especially to firms like public corporations. So how could we maybe understand this then in order to get from deep evolutionary history to firms based on these two cranes? I'm here building on Tomasello. Tomasello has nice work on human morality. And his story is, I think, in large part consistent with what I've been trying to argue so far. He also starts from a state of play with independent individuals who then become interdependent in evolutionary history. He first talks about bilateral interdependence and joint attention and joint, well, sort of joint cognition, but especially joint attention. And then playing roles in bilateral relationships where you complement each other, which requires a certain amount of trust, because then obviously the other has to do what is in the interest of the, in this case, the duo. And then larger groups that then have multilateral interdependence, which then require group norms to hold them together. So the ideas of rules and norms, yeah, basically normative rules of behavior, sort of then start emerging. But of course, for this to work, there needs to be some way, somewhere where this happens, and that is then in the human brain. So we are apparently, and I think there is a lot of evidence to support this, we are sensitive to roles, we are sensitive to norms. And these things, that part of our psychology, the social moral part of our psychology, then helps us keep these higher levels of organizations of groups together. Interestingly, these groups already quite early in evolutionary history also start trading. So there's also markets, some sort of primitive trade already quite early, the stuff that economists really take for granted. And obviously what economics has done in trying to explain firms is to start with markets and then reason in terms of how firms might be an alternative to that. And I think that's starting at the wrong end. I think what's really going on here is that what is happening is that through our social moral psychology, there is a substrate in our brain for institutions, where institutions are understood as rules of the game that we at least partially share, where there's some sort of equilibrium in terms of the rules of the game that we all support, and rules are normative. Therefore, we are talking here about morality. And in this sort of logic, we should then understand how firms may have emerged. That brings us much further into history, because all of what I have on the slide here could apply to very deep evolutionary history. More recently, something like the public corporation was basically instituted, if you will, through two cultural cranes. One is legal personhood, which is a very interesting thing in terms of evolutionary theory and history, and also in terms of evolutionary psychology. So we are now literally in our codified law giving the legal rights of a person to a non-human individual, namely a firm, or also some other types of organization. But let me here talk about firms, and that's firms in general. So there's a cultural crane there that creates almost already this new level of organization, yeah, not just of small bands of hunter and gatherers, but of an institutionalized, artificial, symbolic entity like a firm, but we give it legal personhood. On top of that, in the public corporation, another cultural crane, again, a legal rule, is the rule of capital lock-in. And this is something that economists refuse to understand, or they for ideological reasons, maybe even want to ignore it. What capital lock-in does is that it means that the firm as a legal person owns itself. Capital, which is supplied by shareholders, get locked into the legal person and is no longer controlled by the shareholders. No? And now you have not just a legal person, but you have sort of a legal person that can, in perpetuity, in principle, can perpetually keep on existing, quite independent of the individual stakeholders, whether they be employees, managers, or the shareholders. Of course, economists tend to talk about shareholders as the owners of the firm. I will get to that when I get to corporate governance, but that's just legally incorrect. Yeah, that is not what is happening legally, but I will get back to that if I have time later. So there are also some cultural cranes that are, from an evolutionary perspective, I think quite interesting, and certainly also quite interesting in terms of this notion of major transitions, because we seem to hear through another application of our symbolic language capability or ability, through codified law, we seem to be institutionalizing this individual, the firm, which is at a level above us as individual humans. So that sort of completes my quick attempt at an evolutionary answer to the question, why do firms exist? So as opposed to the economics answer, which starts with markets and then explains firms as sort of a deviation from the market, I try to do it from deep evolutionary history, human organization in general, modern firms in particular. Well, why do firms exist? To support a survival strategy based on interdependence, which is a functional explanation. And then firms are just a modern manifestation of that. And this is the phylogenetic explanation. Why do firms exist? Because of the emergence of a biological and a cultural crane that help us solve the collective action problems that we're trying to solve when we are surviving in this interdependent mode. So again, firms are just a modern manifestation of a general problem of solving collective action problems, but a quite peculiar one, especially because of these cultural cranes that I just discussed, the legal rules. So back to Tinbergen, what I've tried to do is to give an evolutionary explanation, especially the ultimate explanation, but there's a beginning at least of approximate explanation there as well, because these cultural cranes then give us sort of legal templates, and these legal templates sort of in each individual firm, the legal template is maybe a little bit like a genetic code, which then can get expressed in different ways in individual firms. But what all these legal templates are trying to help us and the managers of these firms do is to find a way to manage and govern this collective in such a way that it appeals to moral sentiments that can help overcome the collective action problems that these firms are solving. Okay, let me see. I see that I've already been going for almost half an hour. Let me maybe try at least to do the second part. I'll try to do it very quickly, and then I will probably stop and leave the last part that's okay with you. I'm not seeing the chat, or otherwise, if anyone wants to stop me now, please do. Just speak up. But otherwise, I'll do this part, and then I'll try to do this in a few minutes, and then we can open a discussion.
That sounds perfect, JW. There's some good questions in the chat, and yeah, we'll be ready for that. So yeah, your plan sounds great.
Yeah, but I can also stop here if you prefer.
No. Continue on. Yeah, you're in a good spot. No, it's curious. I'm curious about this one. Go on.
Okay. A second related question is, but a question, interestingly, that economists have not really asked as such, but only derivative from the earlier question. So economists are more interested in why do firms exist as an alternative to the market. Derivative of that, they have to say something about what a firm is, obviously. And interesting thing is you get quite different answers, even in the same, more or less the same literature. So the original view was the firm is a profit-maximizing production function. Well, I won't get into that. That's just a modeling a notion, so that they can do the mathematical modeling. But in organizational economics, which is the part of econ that takes firms a bit more seriously, you get things like, yeah, what is a firm? Well, as an alternative to the market, in the market you have the price that coordinates. In the firm, it's the hierarchy. So somebody is the boss telling you what to do. Then other people say, no, that's nonsense. It's just a nexus of contracts. It's just a different type of contract than the market contracting. And yet another branch says the firms are the owners of the non-human assets. This comes closest to the legal reality. All of this is in the same branch of organizational economics, by the way. Yeah, I won't get into that. There's also a so-called evolutionary stream of evolutionary economics, which talks about firms as collections of routines. And this is quite interesting, even though these people, despite the fact that they're called evolutionary economists, wouldn't think of evolution the way we do. They think of it more as an analogy, where a firm sort of learns through variation, selection, retention, but that's all very loosely defined. What is interesting here, this, as opposed to the other econ theories, these theories all try to put the individual and the free individual, because there's a lot of ideology here, center stage. This approach puts the collective center stage and says a firm is essentially a collection of routines, and routines are then defined as sort of learned collective action patterns that are reliably triggered in reaction to some external signal. So there is a signal, and the system, the firm as a collective system, reacts to the signal by basically starting up a certain routine, which is a collective action pattern. Yeah? And this has been learned in the past, the collective action pattern, and supposedly the routine is fit. Yeah, it helps the firm be successful in its environment. I think this is there's some really nice things here, but it's still a little bit confused if you think of it in terms of evolutionary explanations. I would think of that. Yeah. Now, what is interesting here, the firm as this higher level organization is a carrier of knowledge in its own right. There is something about the firm as a collective entity over and above the knowledge of the individuals. There's something in the social structure or whatever. Yeah, that it's a carrier of collective knowledge that is expressed in these routines. But that's not really an explanation yet. On a generalized Darwinian logic, and some of the publications that I showed you in this long list at the beginning are about this, that literature is still a bit confused. Yeah. And why is it confused? Because it uses this notion of routines both as referring to behavior, a collective action pattern is behavior, and at the same time it also starts using the term for the thing that codes for the behavior. So in terms of a genetic analogy, it's both the phenotype and the genotype at the same time. Yeah, that's not really helping in having a very good explanation of what's going on with firms. So I think that what we should do when we build explanations of how a firm then as an adaptive, complex adaptive system. So once a firm is in existence, in existence, you have this higher level collective entity. That higher level collective entity is an adaptive complex system in its own right. Yeah, it evolves. There is variation, selection, retention going on that, yeah, if given enough time, will lead to adaptive fit of the firm, the system, in its environment. And as the environment changes, variation, selection, retention may mean that the that the entity adapts. But in order for us to understand this, we need a distinction between the whole system and its codex. And my way of doing that is you have the system interacts with its environment. So the system in evolutionary theory would maybe be the organism, interacts with the environment, and over time, the success of that interaction is fed back into the codex. It's encoded. In an organism, that might be in the genetic information. Now, of course, in organisms, this requires generations. In firms, it doesn't. Not necessarily. So you have a distinction between a system that interacts with the environment and a feedback loop of the success or the lack of success of that interaction with the environment feeding back into the codex, where basically how the system behaves becomes encoded. Now that's still very general, but it gets us a bit closer to where I want to go with this, which is also a link to evolutionary epistemology. And I really like Plotkin's stuff there. And in my mind, what Plotkins basically says is, look, philosophers have all these ideas about epistemology and about knowledge, but from an evolutionary perspective, knowledge is just a form of adaptation. And adaptation here is the noun, not the verb adaptation, but the noun, an adaptation. An adaptation is knowledge, and vice versa. And Plotkin goes quite far in saying, look, they're the same thing, just using different language. And we know that adaptation is the result of an evolutionary process. But that means that if knowledge and adaptation are the same thing, then it must mean that knowledge can only come from what we typically call learning. Learning must then, by nature, be an evolutionary process that proceeds to variation, selection, retention. And I'm on board with this argument. I think all learning is an evolutionary process in the sense of variation, selection, retention that gets to adaptations. And it works, I think, also in organizations. But then the interesting question becomes, where does the knowledge, the collective level knowledge of the organization resides? And the current evolutionary economic literature would say in the routines, and I say no, that's impossible. The routines are a behavior, and the knowledge doesn't reside in the behavior. There must be something coding for the behavior. So we need to disentangle these two things. It must be in the firm's codex. Now, of course, by saying that, I'm not being very specific. This just leads to the next question: how are we to understand the firm's codex? And maybe one way of understanding the codex of a firm, where the collective level knowledge of a social system like that resides, is in terms of what I call a 3R configuration. Now, what are these 3 Rs? It's some configuration of resources, roles, and rules. And the rules are central here. In fact, roles in part are about expected behaviors, division of labor and expected behaviors. But resources, roles, and rules, there's a configuration of resources, roles, and rules. And what evolves is that configuration, the codex, through interactions with the environment. And maybe that helps us get us a little bit closer to understanding firms as adaptive complex systems, and not just talking about routines, which is both phenotype and genotype. So an evolutionary answer, I think, to the question, what are firms? They are complex adaptive systems that encode collective knowledge of what works in a particular environment in this codex where the rules are central, in a set of rules. And rules, of course, are normative, which gets us to politics, but I don't have time for that. You can talk about operational rules, but also governance rules. Governance rules gets us to politics. But I'll leave it there, because otherwise I'll be talking the whole hour. That's not the idea. Thank you. You said that I should manage the questions, Ed, or do you want to do it? Or there's stuff in the chat that I should first react to?
No, I thought, you could manage it. I
haven't looked at the chat.
No, don't worry about the chat. We can probably, if people want to, we'll enter the chat later online if we want. But if people want to bring up some of the questions, actually, I mean, I'll bring up a theme that was running through there was.
Could we raise hands? Could we have a raise hands convention?
Yeah, exactly. That would be the good way
So
to continue on from
raise
that.
hands if you want to raise hands if you want to speak, and we'll go in that order.
Yep, and then we'll let JW kind of pick and choose those from that order. But I'll just, since I'm going, I'll just summarize one of the things in the chat was, what is the difference between a firm and the Catholic Church, or any old kind of organization that's going on? Are those also experiencing these major evolutionary transitions as you're describing them, or just in a slightly different way, or what's distinctive about the firm in your view here?
Yeah, that's a good and certainly very reasonable question. So when in business schools, which is sort of my professional environment as a management scholar, we have a tendency to look first at for-profit organizations, which we typically refer to as firms. And within that, there's a bit of a tendency, certainly in the part of the management schools where I am, strategy, to focus on these public corporations, the big ones. But of course, a lot of what we're saying goes to organizations much more generally, also to non-profit organizations. And as I said with so many words, it may be generalized to any type of institution. Some of these arguments may even also translate to markets, because markets are economists tend to think of them as sort of a free-for-all, but they're heavily institutionalized. They're heavily set within a set of rules and a norm system. So yeah, how is a firm different from a Catholic Church? In some ways, they're just the same. They're types of human organization. Yeah, there are some differences in the for-profit or not. There are some differences in the legal status, certainly public corporation with capital lock-in and things like that. But the interesting thing is that the public corporation actually evolved from things like churches and universities. So the legal history starts with non-profits, sort of social service type of organizations that were given legal personhood, which was then later extended to for-profit firms. Yeah. So that's a two-part answer. In some ways, much of this should generalize. In other ways, there is something peculiar about it. Let's see. I just go in the order. I think Andy. Then on my Ed, correct me if I'm not doing the. But
that's the idea. I think just in order, so it'd be.
Yeah.
Andy,
So
yeah, it should be
the order I'm seeing is Andy first. But is that correct? Andy, please.
Sure. Thank you, JD. Really interesting stuff. This all makes a lot of sense to me. I'm wondering if you can tell me more about what Peter Godfrey Smith has in mind when he talks about merger into a higher level entity constituting or de-Darwinization. I can understand that individual selective pressures can be suppressed when a higher level entity comes into existence, but it's not as though the entity has stepped outside of a world where Darwinian processes are still at work. I guess part of the question is, what do we mean by Darwinian? Does Darwinian mean just the struggle for survival among individuals, or does the formation of higher level entities and their struggle to maintain themselves, is that also Darwinian?
Yeah, let me first make sure that I understand. So I mentioned Godfrey Smith and his term de-Darwinization. That's what you're referring to, right? Yeah.
Right.
Then, if I remember correctly, what he says exactly there, it's been a while since I actually read that, but the essence of what he's saying is that he talks about de-Darwinization when the individual members of the higher level entity can no longer survive on their own. So they become completely, they can only survive as part of the higher level entity. So it's sort of, we don't just have multi-level selection tensions. These have been resolved in favor of the higher level entity in such a way that there's very limited competition. And then of course you say, but even then there may be, yes, cancer is an example of that, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
But if he uses the term, and I think he also means to use the term, as it were, in the sense of completing this transition, where basically the between group competition is so much more powerful than the within group competition, that this whole entity, and the parts of it can only survive as part of the entity, basically.
Yeah, just tack on the thought that I don't think Darwin would have dreamt of denying that such things happen, or nor do I think that his evolutionary triad sort of ceases to become applicable once higher level creator entities emerge. So to me, the word de-Darwinize feels wrong, but
yeah,
it's a semantic quibble, maybe.
Yeah, no, but I think I sympathize with what you're saying there. Maybe what he means to why he may have chosen the label is because the competition is no longer within, it's only between, maybe something like that. But I certainly do, and I don't have the details right now, but when I read this, what is it, 2009 book or 2011, I even forget the date, but anyway, the book where this is one of the chapters, there's one thing where he goes beyond biological evolution. I completely disagree with what he's saying there.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you, JW.
That sort of this triad thing, I think, is there. Robert.
Yeah, very interesting, JW. I wanted to ask about the notion that you had of capital lock-in and the way that you described that. And I think maybe I just misunderstood it. So I just have first a general question about that. It seemed like you were saying that there's sort of a sense in which the classical view, the shareholders, the stockholders are the owners, they're the active agents. But then once the firm becomes a person in a legal sense, it then has a kind of agency that's independent. And it's different from the biological case. I thought you were saying in that the shareholders may die off, but the firm doesn't. Is that the key point that you're making?
Yeah, so there's a few things to what you're saying, all of which are interesting and subtle to some degree. But the capital lock-in as a legal term simply means that, and this comes on top of legal person. So you don't necessarily need to have both, right? But in a public
You're saying it's an effect of that, right? It's a side effect.
No, it's an additional legal innovation, if you will.
Okay.
Yeah, so the legal personhood is a cultural innovation, if you will. And then once you have legal personhood, you can also have capital lock-in. You don't have to have capital lock-in, but you can have that. And in the public corporation, what happens is that investors, so shareholders especially, they invest in the firm. And what they invest, they relinquish control, or at least largely relinquish control to the legal person itself, who then becomes the owner of the capital.
Right.
And the whole, and I didn't get to the corporate governance part. Maybe I was a bit naive in how much I could cover in 35 minutes, but I didn't get to the corporate governance part. But the way economists want to talk about this, about the public corporation, is in terms of shareholders as the owners of firms who should have the control, who have the control, they should have the control. Well, legally, they don't have much control at all. Only on the bankruptcy, there are some rules that give them some control, but then they're sort of last in the line of, of all the claimants. So legally, there is all kinds of stuff that goes against the traditional economic narrative. So capital lock-in as a legal term just means that investors relinquish control over their capital investments to the legal person itself. The legal person is managed by a board, and that board more or less has control over what is going on, and courts hardly ever intervene, also not on behalf of shareholders. That's basically the notion.
Right, good. So that's in line with the way I had understood this. The point that I was asking was about this. What I thought you were drawing was a contrast between that kind of case of the relinquishing of control to the emerged organism as a contrast to the biological case. And I would have said that the biological case is actually very similar to that, right? The cells give up control in some way to the organism as a whole, the individual cells. In fact, individual cells can be replaced all the time, right? And the organism continues on in a form. So I think that's actually parallel in that kind of way.
Yeah, I'm completely with you, and I think where I may have been confusing to you as an audience is in terms of the biology. That's exactly the point, the way where you're saying that. My point of the contrast was that reality does not correspond to how economists like to talk about these terms. Right?
Yeah. So that this makes good sense. I had in an earlier time sort of argued against this idea of why we should allow this idea of legal personhood, because it seems to me as that there are actually other kinds of disanalogies that are more significant that from a moral point of view would argue against
legal
personhood of doing that. So I think there's a separation from the legal notion and what would be the moral notion of personhood. But I think it goes along with what you've said. So yeah.
Very quickly to that, because there's other people waiting. But
yeah.
I said in first response to you was, you raise a few things, so all of which are interesting and some of which are very subtle. And this part about what is morally a good thing or not is a biggie. Yeah, because what we are doing through this cultural crane is indeed institutionalizing a higher level of organization, and we are in some sense contributing to this, whether we like to term or not, de-Darwinization by doing so. Yeah, and whether we should want to do that or not. And this is, of course, it has huge practical implications, certainly in the US. I'm not from the US, but in the US, where not so long ago, this whole idea of what firms can do, or even that they have freedom of speech, and they can lobby, I mean, really, really very dangerous. Yeah?
Exactly. That's my point. So good. That's good. Yeah. Another time we'll talk about it. I'll let others speak.
Yeah. Andy, please. Thank you. Andy.
I was very interested in this moral language idea you had. I've traditionally used memes for this, but it seems to me that this moral language is, well, the metaphorical DNA of the firm. It's the substrate for how firms evolve. And the symbols are the expressed as organizational phenotypes as these routines and competencies. I also picked up from that the collective action problems are the selection pressure on how this language evolves into different dialects and different languages, and therefore different dialects results in different kinds of firms. I was also interested in what do you think of using that kind of model to explain maladaptations, things like bureaucracy and the F laws, if you've heard of those, F laws. Yeah. So common problems in firms like bureaucracy, office politics, all those kinds of things, versus something like administrative management, which is effective. Bureaucracy versus administrative management.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about where to start. Maybe just with the first thing. So I think in articulating your question, you were using. So when I use moral language, it's still a bit vague as a concept. Certainly the way I quickly use it today. So I use language there in the sense of what I think Maynard Smith and Zat Maria are about. This is a different way of storing, but especially transmitting information. And as I added, coordinating people. So moral language may be that if I now make a bad joke, you may raise your eyebrow. Yeah, so this is language between you and me as individuals that we have, and also the other people here. And if we would be in a room, it would be even more obvious, where we sort of, in some way, we have evolved as a human species a language that can be symbolic, but it can also be raising the eyebrow, which I guess is still symbolic, but it's biologically, it's not written language or symbolic in that sense. Yeah, where we sort of enact and maintain certain rules of behavior. So I'm really using it, and I realize it's still a little bit vague, but I'm really using it to say, okay, what has allowed us to make this major transition? Yes, language, and yes, symbolic language. They also say that themselves. But what about is special that overcomes this problem? And to overcome the problem, you have to get away from self-interest. We have self-interested tendencies, but we also have other tendencies, these moral, and we can trigger them in each other through this language. And I'm using it in a still a vague sense that could go from raising the eyebrow to, I don't know, maybe we even smell it when people disagree with us. I don't know how hormones work and things like that. I haven't studied that. Yeah, or we have codified law, but that's very much further in history. And I think you were using it more at the level of an individual firm. And I do not disagree with what you were saying there. Different firms have different dialects. I think different national cultures have different dialects. Yeah, there's different ways of solving collective action problems. You create a community feeling, or you get some benevolent dictator to tell you what to do, or you get a repeated game with just reciprocity. There's all kinds of ways of solving, or you make it go away by making, taking the interdependence away. You organize the interdependence out, then you have a market. There's different ways of solving it. Yeah, at the macro scale, yeah, there are different ways in which individual firms do it. They have their different cultures. I would agree with you. Yeah. And to your point of just the different dialects, yes, I like that. Yeah, there's different ways of solving collective action problems. And there's some research about that. For instance, I've used something from Fiske, which is about different ways of framing social situations. And I've tried to understand that he talks about communal sharing, authority ranking, equality matching, and market pricing. I've tried to understand it as solutions to collective action problems. And then the maladaptations. Yeah, I think David already also made the point about if we look at any trait, whether it's a biological trait or a characteristic of a firm, yeah, is it something that fits? Is it something that may have fit in the past, but that doesn't fit anymore and therefore has become maladaptive? Is it overshooting? It's also possible. It's sort of like a peacock's tail, that it's overshooting in one respect because it's adaptive in some other respect. That may all be happening, or it may just be drift. Yeah, and some of that may get selected out if there's enough competition. Some of that may linger for quite a while and be maladaptive for quite a while. So yeah, we cannot get away from also acknowledging that things don't always make sense. And this is even before we get to evolutionary mismatches in our own individual psychology. Yeah, that's yet another story of mismatch. I mean, the fact that we identify so strongly with things like firms, and that, for instance, I mean, in the Netherlands, if I look at our politicians, we used to have an efficient government, no longer so. And one explanation is because all these bureaucrats who used to be so efficient are now efficient in basically protecting the interest of their own little agencies against the wider collective interest. That somehow not the moral frame is no longer the collective interest. The moral frame is still a moral frame, is to do the best for their agency, because that's where their identity as a professional apparently is. But it's maladaptive at the global level.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. David.
Well, we're at time. So do we have time for one more question? Or
I have time, and I would certainly like to hear yours. So, but Ed, I think you can interrupt.
Oh yeah, I'll be around. Yeah, I can record as long as we need to. Yeah, let's keep going too, please. Sure.
Well,
Yeah,
so much to ask, but I'll confine it to just one. Do you have experience presenting this information to actual firms, and in a way that they find useful? So, I mean, if you're in management and have relationships with firms, at what point is this new paradigm ready to be used in a practical sense in consulting relationships with real firms?
That's a very good question, and it's also a bit of a psychologically uncomfortable question for me, because as a management scholar, I'm sort of in between the world of practice and the world of academia. And I was doing much more practical stuff in the 90s. I was working much more with firms, and then I wasn't doing this research. Now I've been becoming more of a researcher. I'm not doing the work with firms anymore. And in part that is because of how the institutions work and how management schools work and publish and perish and what have you. So if you would really put a gun to my head and say, you know, what would you be able to do with this right now for practicing managers? I would have to think quite hard. What I do to some degree is with my students. So we have relatively academic-minded master programs in business and management in the Netherlands in general, and also certainly at my university. So these people basically come there not for the sort of thing that they would get in an American MBA, which is quite instrumental. And so I have students who are a little bit older. They're not executives, and there I can get some of them interested in this, but it takes me, you know, over a course of 6 weeks. I have a course, I build it up, I sort of make them a bit uncomfortable with some of the economic thinking, and then I start to introduce these counterpoints, and these are, some of them are in the late 20s, some of them are in the mid 30s, and there's an occasional one that is 40 or even 50. And they do this while they work. And I can talk to these people about it, but it takes me a little bit more time. If I would have to package this, and I'm beginning to get to the point where I would like to package it and also just have a relatively smooth TED Talk type, but you know, I cannot do this in 15 minutes, but maybe there's a way of doing part of it or snippets of it in 15 minutes. I should still work on that. I'm maybe slowly getting there. It's easier for me to talk to you guys right now. Yeah, and it's okay for me to talk to my students if I have 6 weeks and I can weave it in. If you would ask me, can you go to a Fortune 500 company, you know, tomorrow and convince the managing directors of a new vision for the world? No, probably not. No? I was on my way of doing that sort of stuff in the 90s when I was much younger, but then I wouldn't have had this story if I would have continued there. Maybe when I'm in the phase of my career where you are, maybe I will have the time, wisdom, and the snappy way of delivering it that I could do it, but I should work on that.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you all. Andy, you still have your hand up? Is that a new one?
Well, I did want to toss in an interesting example ripped from the headlines. I believe there was a $100 million judgment that came down against the consulting firm, the accounting firm Ernst & Young. It turns out they had developed an ethics test, and they were using it to screen out ethical applicants for their accounting positions so that they could pad their own profit margins by offering.
How recent was this? I haven't heard of this.
I heard a reference to it just this last weekend, so very recent. But what's interesting there, right, is that you have the interests of the firm, Ernst & Young, were in competition with the interests of the society as a whole. And what was adaptive for one was, you know, decidedly maladaptive or corrosive of society more generally. So there's a really interesting example of sort of multi-level organizations at different levels with competing interests.
Yeah, and to very shortly add to this, I mean, I think at least in the past, my natural tendency of reacting to these sorts of cases was, look, this is just these people who are in self-interested mode. But it's worse than that. These people may be in moral mode. They just are invoking different moral rules within their own in-group at the expense of the rest of the world.
Well, but you can also...
There may be all kind of moral appeals to the people that are doing this and that are working in this company, which are about moral appeals within the group. Yeah?
Well, but you can also provide a purely capitalistic rationale for not hiring ethical accountants, right? If ethical accountants don't give your clients what they want in the way of, rubber stamps on their books, and so you weed them out specifically, and you could say we had to do that. It's our obligation as caretakers of the resources shareholders have put in our care. And you can even be prosecuted if you don't use a corporation's resources to maximize profit. So
that's probably not true, but some people will at least want to claim that you could. That there's all kinds of debates in the legal literature about these things, and I'm also there. I'm again no specialist, but these things are tricky, and there is much less of a duty there than certain people are trying to make out.
Fair enough. I'm sure your knowledge goes much deeper here, but there's at least some arguments that.
Yeah, they are there. Certainly in the absolutely. They are certainly in the public sphere. Yeah. And there's again a moral undertone there.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the simple economic story is also propped up by the moral claim that if we do what neoliberalism tells us, we can have both maximum individual freedom and maximum social welfare. There's no arguing with that. There is arguing, and I'm trying to do that in some of my recent papers, but that's another thing. But by itself, that's a very, very strong moral claim that shuts up almost everybody, unless you understand why their argument goes wrong. And very few people even bother to point that out. Certainly not economists themselves.
Well, and I think one of David's motives in asking his question was that he's wondering if evolutionary theory can help unravel the force of that argument and help people in the business world become more pro-social.
Yeah.
In their approach to.
No, I completely share that aim with David, very much so. I mean, a big part of what I'm doing, but like I said, there hasn't been that much evolutionary arguments in the stakeholder theory work that I've been doing. But for the next 1 or 2 years, I'm going to try to merge these two. So part of what I'm presenting here is going to be probably multiple papers, and some of them will talk about corporate governance, the bit that I didn't have time for, which is very much about making another sort of normative point about what firms are and should be about. Yeah, that's where I'm heading with this.
That's really important work, JW. I wish you all speed with that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna sign off, guys. But JW, thank you. And
sorry for keeping you all so long, but thanks a lot. If there are other questions, I'm happy to answer them. But I can also imagine that we might want to wrap it up.